Welcome back to another installment of the Who Won This Overwatch League trade series. What we do is look back at how specific trades throughout history affected all participants involved to decide the true winner. Currently, we are on the topic of player-for-player trades, and so far, we have covered OG for Decay and Dante for Smurf. Links to those videos can be found in the playlist down below if you're interested. In this edition of the Who Won This trade series, we're going to be exploring the time the Los Angeles Valiant traded Fate to the Florida Mayhem in return for Mcgravy, Shax, and Fact Fiction. My overview of this trade is that it's one that ended up being mutually beneficial. More on why I think that is a bit later in the video, but before we can seriously talk about the outcome and who benefited more, if anyone at all, it's important to set the scene with some background information. I recognize that not all of my viewers were around during Season 2, so I figured it might be useful. So this trade went down about halfway through 2019. Basically, the Valiant and the Mayhem were struggling terribly. At 3-11 and 1-13 respectively, both teams were amongst the bottom of the overall standings. The Valiant got off to a slow start while playing way below their preseason expectations. Meanwhile, the Mayhem were kind of just dealing with an identity crisis. Their poorly built roster led to some very terrible results, and that ultimately led to a decision to field a totally Korean roster to hopefully build up some better synergy and build a better team heading into the future. Despite a really bad start, the Valiant were still looking to make some changes to hopefully resurrect their season before it was too late. After making some questionable lineup decisions, Coach Moon ended up getting let go of, and due to this, it was clear that Fate would not want to stay with the team. He wasn't playing the greatest either, so a fresh start was in his and the team's best interest. Despite a not-so-great start to the year compared to 2018, teams would surely still have interest in Fate, and according to the rumors, the Florida Mayhem were not the only team. He was a veteran who was all-star level under the right circumstances for sure, and in return, the Valiant were looking for a new main tank with a stronger Reinhardt who also kind of just let Custa handle more of the leadership duties himself. Enter the Florida Mayhem and their academy team. The Mayhem possessed players, Western players mind you, that they weren't going to promote for obvious reasons, people that could possibly play well under Packing 10's coaching mind you, and because of Fate's trade value, the Valiant could probably end up scoring more than one of those guys if they played their cards right. Little did we know at the time that this ended up being the perfect trade partnership. Florida desperately needed to rebuild their tank line, which honestly might have been the worst in the league at the time. A real main tank was a great place to start. They wanted Fate from the Valiant, and it was clear that the Valiant had someone they wanted in return, or multiple people. Former Houston Outlaws and Team USA representative Fact Fiction was the big standout person that they really wanted in this deal. And that, my friends, is what led down the road to the Mayhem and Valiant swapping Fate for Fact Fiction. Despite a short tenure on the Houston Outlaws, Fact Fiction had proven himself on Mayhem Academy. There were questions, of course, on how good he could be at this level, but at the very least, he did have good experience. But as an additional bonus, the Valiant walked away with two intriguing prospects in Shax and Mcgravy. Mcgravy had actually played a few games for Florida during the season before everything happened where the team went fully Korean, and he looked like a real bright spot. Now, of course, at that specific time period, he didn't have much use since Space was still on the roster, but maybe he could end up being a future piece if something were to happen to Space. But honestly, the more intriguing guy ended up being Shax, because everybody at the time was telling me that this was huge when the news broke. Supposedly, he was really popping off on Florida's academy team and honestly deserved a shot at this level. I personally did not have high expectations since I didn't get much of a chance to watch him, but it was good to know that he at least had potential. So yeah, both teams honestly walked away with something that could be of value. The Mayhem had it especially good in my eyes though because they upgraded main tank while giving away assets they weren't going to use anyway. If you ask me, it sounds like the most ideal trade scenario possible. But honestly, as the rest of the season played out, it was safe to say that both teams had won in some type of way. What the Valiant got was an exciting second half of the season. They saw results instantly during Stage 3 with a 5-2 record that saw them take down multiple high-level opponents like the Stage 3 champion Shanghai Dragons, the Vancouver Titans, and the Hangzhou Spark. And the best part about it was they were getting good use both out of Fact Fiction and Shax. They were each playing a role in this type of resurgence that was going on. Fact Fiction's style of play and synergy seemed to work better than Fate, but more importantly, Shax led the way to a huge difference in overall performance. At the time, the Valiant weren't clicking with GOATs, so they did what a bunch of other teams decided to do. they played Sombra Goats instead, and that is where Shax really earned his spot on the team. His Sombra led the way to a drastic improvement in team performance and overall confidence. I wouldn't say that he was the best in the league on Sombra or anything like that, or if he was the main catalyst behind the Valiant's resurgence, but you certainly did have to take him seriously. Needless to say, the new guys were fitting in just fine, and that never really changed for the final few months either. Yeah, the Valiant did end up coming short of their goal of making the play-in tournament, but going 9-5 after the trade isn't bad at all, especially when you consider that triples the amount of wins they had throughout the first half of the year. And through it all, Shax in particular continued to be reliable. During the role lock, he showed promise on Reaper, Cassidy, and Widowmaker. Despite their playoff shortcomings, this was basically a 3-1 W. You got a replacement at main tank to get you through the year, a new promising DPS player who can be a part of your rotation for years to come, and an exciting second half of the year that actually made the Valiant worth watching again. All in all, the Valiant did good in the initial months after this trade. As we look at this from the Mayhem's perspective, they weren't as lucky, at least early on. They weren't really in a state where they were truly ready to win now. Even with Fate on the team, they were still lacking in so many other departments, and it's pretty evident by their 1-6 Stage 3 record to accompany their worst map differential in a single stage that year. It was going to take some time for this trade to be of value to them, it was very clear. But then we hit Stage 4, where their luck finally started to turn around. Playoffs were impossible to make now, but at the very least they could end the season on a great mark, and that's kind of what happened, because the role lock first and foremost was massive. Fate's Orisa was one of his strong points, and he got to play a ton of her. You could certainly feel his presence much more on that hero than Reinhardt, let's say. We also saw BQB and Saya player receive similar benefits from the meta change, but you also have the emergence of Gargoyle, who truly killed off all concerns about the tank line. As a result of all of this, the Mayhem finished with an above 500 record in a stage for the first time ever. Slowly but surely, it was all starting to come together. Before we talk about Season 3 and onward, I think it was clear that the Valiant had the slight edge with who was winning the trade at the end of 2019. They were winning games and getting use out of pretty much all of their pieces aside from Mcgravy. Meanwhile, the Mayhem still lost more than they won, but you know, despite all of this, there was still a lot of hope for them to walk away as the bigger winners if they could just carry that momentum into 2020. And honestly, just the offseason itself made this trade feel more even right away as the Valiant and Fact Fiction parted ways. In my opinion, that was actually pretty big at the time. All they got out of him was 16 games when including the Stage 3 playoffs. He was helpful, yes, but he essentially just served as a way to make ends meet, an emergency option if you will. But I guess in a way that departure kind of got cancelled out by Mcgravy moving into the new starting off-tank role. The Valiant were utilizing their new pieces to the maximum, but the Mayhem's offseason haul made it seem like they might be moving ahead in this race, and from a record standpoint, that is definitely what we saw. Aside from some early struggles in the first few weeks, Florida played so well in 2020. A top 6 record with multiple high finishes in tournaments is worthy of some praise, and all of it came with Fate starting nearly every game, and on top of it all, people were once again calling him one of the high-level main tanks of the Overwatch League. He wasn't the main attraction of his team by any means, but the stats held up nicely. And once Double Shield became a mainstay in the meta, Fate and Gargoyle became one of the most fearsome tank lines in the league. But the thing is, the Valiant found good success of their own while consistently utilizing both Mcgravy and Shax. Admittedly speaking, Mcgravy was not amazing, but he still did fill the hole at off-tank much like how Fact Fiction did at main tank in 2019. But the real story definitely comes through Shax, because he became a star tracer around the start of the summer really. That stretch of time saw him play at a very high level. To have the top final blow per 10 average on the year as tracer when Striker, Decay, and Yaki among others are in the league is not something to overlook. He honestly played a massive role in the Valiant's mid to late season playoff push. He played a part in most of their biggest wins that season as well. There's the reverse sweep against Atlanta and beating Paris in the May Melee. And when you think about the head-to-head with Florida, Shax played amazingly to help the Valiant beat them every single time they played that season. In the grand scheme of things, the Mayhem technically lasted longer in the playoffs, so it's up to you to decide if the head-to-head really means anything or not. It is worth mentioning, however, that the Valiant did beat the Mayhem during the playoffs, so I think that has to count for something. Overall, Season 3 proved to bear fruit for both sides when it comes to the trade. The Valiant for being a dark horse competitor, and the Mayhem for being a top team in the league. But sadly, this is actually where any consideration of how this trade went down for both sides ends. Because coincidentally, all players left involved with this trade were now off of the Valiant and Mayhem by the start of Season 4. Mcgravy for not being good enough, Shax because of the whole Valiant roster drama thing, and Fate, who moved on to the Shanghai Dragons to be reunited with his longtime friend Coach Moon. When it comes to longevity, the Valiant and the Mayhem are on equal ground. They both had a season and a half essentially with their respective trade pieces, and in terms of general success, they were pretty darn close. Through 2019 when the trade happened until the end of 2020, the Valiant made 4 regular season tournaments and the 2020 playoffs. On the other hand, the Mayhem made 3 regular season tournaments in the 2020 playoffs as well, but unlike the Valiant, the Mayhem did make a tournament finals and were 1 game away from the losers finals during the 2020 playoffs. When it comes to general records that do not include any sort of playoff or tournament play, the Valiant posted 20 wins and 15 losses over 1.5 seasons. On the other side of it, the Mayhem went 19-16, which means that there was a 1-win separation between the two. And when considering the Mayhem's tournament success, you might argue they were on the better end of the success thing by a slight margin. As for the head-to-head, this one is heavily one-sided in favor of the Valiant, as they won all 4 meetings that happened after the trade. And again, just remember that one of those games ended up knocking the Mayhem down to the losers bracket of the playoffs pretty early. So really, it's pretty difficult to say that one team was absolutely better off than the other. No team got more time out of their trade pieces, they posted similar records, they both made multiple tournaments, and they each were consistently utilizing their new players. It's as close as you can get with this kind of trade. In order to decide a winner, you've really got to look into which side got more value out of their players. When looking at Fate, he made an impact for most of the time that he was around. The moment that Goats died out, he was a consistent contributor to the franchise as he got the job done on both Winston and Orisa and provided great leadership that really helped out a young Florida squad back in 2020. Fate was never like the #1 main tank in the Overwatch League while wearing a Florida uniform, but he was still very serviceable and super consistent, and that's all the Mayhem really wanted out of him. Now considering the Valiant, every single one of their players was of use at one point or another. All 3 guys never started all at the same time, but the fact is that they were all starters at one point or another, which is pretty extraordinary. But when I really think hard about it, only Shax truly lived up to the level that Fate was playing at, because Fact Fiction, while decent, was mostly only playing well on Rhine. His impact definitely did slip off a bit in Stage 4. Synergy-wise, he worked out, sure, but he wasn't a ridiculous playmaker that the Valiant couldn't live without. He was used to get through the year. Nothing more, nothing less. And seriously, something else you gotta think about are the rumors with him, because supposedly, whenever the Valiant weren't playing well in games, he'd go very quiet in the comms, which is not a great look. And I genuinely feel a similar way about Mcgravy in terms of impact. He was a budget option on a budget team in 2020, and aside from some very early moments in Season 3, the community mostly viewed him as average at best. And I do not mean any disrespect towards Mcgravy here, because I really do like him. I'm just calling it how it was at the time. There had to have been at least 10 other off-tanks you would rather have. He certainly had his inconsistencies, especially when he had to flex off of D.Va. The good news though is that Mcgravy definitely did find other ways to be of use. What he couldn't do in game, he kind of did make up for at times by being one of the best teammates I've literally ever seen. Performance is of course the most desirable thing, but leadership and being someone your team can rally around is also very important, so all in all, Mcgravy did have uses. But still, when comparing what Fate did to Fact Fiction and Mcgravy, you've got to favor Florida. However, things get a bit more interesting when you factor in Shax, because what Shax did in 27 games deserves a lot of credit. He played critical roles in back-to-back years. He played a serviceable Sombra on Reaper during Season 2, and he also had an insane Tracer in Season 3 that helped the Valiant win quite a few crucial games. The only thing I can really think of that you could maybe pit against Shax was that he wasn't always a starter, and usually we thought of Kai when talking about the main catalyst behind the Season 3 squad, but then again, Fate was in a similar position. Some people forget that Karian was actually the starter during the early weeks of Season 3 due to Reinhardt's relevance, and as good as Fate was, I think more eyes overall were drawn towards Gargoyle, Yaki, BQB, and Gangnam Jin. To be brutally honest with you, both teams feel like winners no matter how you slice it. They're so similar in every way imaginable, but this video wouldn't be any fun at all if we consider this a tie, now would it? Maybe this is the former Valiant fan in me talking, but in my opinion, they win this trade by the slightest of margins, and my reason behind this is the sheer value that they got out of all of their players. To find a use for all 3 guys that you received in this one trade is very impressive. Their level of importance definitely varies, but none of them were useless. It takes a well-coached environment and true recognition for talent to make 3 lesser-known players serve a purpose to your success. Am I the only one out there that thinks that this is like a massive accomplishment? We've seen teams in the past struggle just to integrate 1 player from a trade, let alone 3. Again, I want it to be known that this is by no means a lopsided trade. The Mayhem did very well with Fate, and I think acquiring him really did signal the start of a turnaround. But the Valiant have the numbers advantage here, plus that little playoff victory they got over them. The Valiant turned what seemed like nothing significant really at the time into a season and a half worth of quality service. So by a small margin, I'd say that the Valiant won this trade due to the various uses they got out of all 3 of their new players. And on that note, that pretty much concludes my thoughts on who won the Fate for Fact Fiction, Shax, and Mcgravy trade. Let me know who you think won this trade and why down in the comments below. Do you agree with me, or do you think the Mayhem come out on top? And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to this channel if you want future Who Won the Trade content just like this. And as always, thank you all so much for watching my content. I really appreciate every single one of you. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.